Welcome to my 14-day SAT prep course. Today is day 2 in the 14-day SAT prep course, and today I'll be taking you through the rest of the grammar rules that we started yesterday, as well as some time with the reading section, dealing with strategies for the reading section, as well as a brief outline of what it is and what you need to know for it. After that, we will then wrap it up with a little bit of math as well. So we're going to be touching on math, writing, and reading all in today's video. So with that, make sure to like, subscribe, and share, and let's go ahead and get started finishing up those grammar rules that we started yesterday. All right, so we're going to start right where we left off yesterday, and that is with context. So on the SAT writing section, context is everything. So what do I mean by that? Well, the words in the passage have to make sense based on the context in which they appear. So this means that you actually have to read the passage. Okay, so even though some questions on the SAT writing section can be answered just by knowing things such as grammar rules, you should be reading the passage because there are words in context that you'll have to know in order to get those words in context questions right, you have to have been reading the passage. So this type of passage, or this type of passage reading, so as you read through this type of passage, it's a lot different than the way that you would read through the reading section. So when you read through the reading section of the reading test of the SAT, you're looking for things such as what the big picture of the plot is, what different pieces of evidence supporting different claims are, if it's a history passage, what people's main arguments are and how they're supporting them and things like that. But when you're reading through the SAT writing section, what you're looking for is things that are much, much different, right? You're looking at things such as nouns, verbs, what tense we're in, what style we're employing, and things like that, right? Because that's going to help you get those grammar questions correct. So as you read through the SAT writing section, you want to make sure you're paying attention to verbs. Okay, what number, what's the number of the verb, what tense is the verb, what number is the subject, what is the tense, what's the subject, is there parallelism, right? Parallelism is very important to look for as well. Pay attention to tone, paragraph structure, and the flow of ideas within that passage. Those are the big things you want to focus on as you go through the SAT writing section. So let's go ahead and get into some examples. All right, so we have an example question here. We have, well, John, and then we have one word underlined, right? In this case, it's entertained. If I have one word underlined in the middle of my sentence, I know that I'm probably looking at something that's either dealing with a subject and verb matching in number or in tense or both. So in this case, I see I have, well, John has entertained. The word has indicates to me that I'm going to be dealing in some sort of past tense. And another reason that I know I'm going to be dealing as past tense is as I read on, I see the idea of imposing a speed limit of 33 miles per hour. He has not considered, so considered another past tense verb, the increased traffic that will cause. Okay, so obviously I'll be doing the past tense, which means I can get rid of sustain, which is option A. I can also get rid of entertain. I can also get rid of, it looks like those are the only two that were not in the past tense. Now I'm left between proposed, argued, and entertained. All right, so now this question type, and another thing that's important for the SAT writing section is understanding question types, deals with related or similar words, right? So finding the best word choice here. So if I look at my options, I have proposed, I have argued, and I have entertained. So what jumps out to me immediately is I have, well, John, okay? That's indicating to me already that it's kind of a contrast, right? So while he has done one thing, he has not considered something else, right? We wouldn't say, well, John has entertained the idea of imposing a speed limit of 33 miles per hour. He has not considered the increased traffic it will cause, because if he's only entertaining it, then it doesn't really matter if he hasn't considered that increased traffic. So entertained would not be our correct answer here, so we can go ahead and get rid of no change. Now we're left between argued and proposed. We wouldn't say, well, John has argued the idea of imposing a speed limit of 33 miles per hour because it doesn't tell us what side he is on. So then we can't go back and say he has not considered the increased traffic that will cause because we don't know which side he's on. He could be on a side that helps as evidence or that it doesn't help as evidence. So D would be incorrect as well. So our correct answer then would be B, proposed, right? Well, he has proposed the idea of imposing a speed limit of 33 miles per hour. He's not considered the increased traffic that will cause. That obviously shows the correct relationship between those two parts of our sentence. It also maintains match between our subject and our verb and number and in tense. So our correct answer there would be B. Now keep in mind that this example question is one that I made up, and that would be realistically probably one of the harder questions like this where you're just picking one word out in the middle of a sentence. This would be a really pretty much probably the most difficult question type that you could kind of see on this one in my opinion. So just keep in mind that most of the time it'll be easier to pick out that word and put in a different one because most of the time only one option or two options will match in number to the subject and the verb, and then one of the options will be in the wrong tense. So then you'll just be able to find the correct answer based on tense and on it matching in subject, the subject number to the verb number. So generally they'll be easier than that question was, but I wanted to make that one a little bit difficult just so you kind of understood what I was talking about. All right, next up we have another example question. So we have there are 15 types of beetles in America. Okay, now what type of question is this? Well, we see we have there underlined. Anytime that I see a homophone underlined, that's an indication to me that it's just probably going to end up being a question that tests me on homophones, right? So in this case, my question type is homophones, right? I see that obviously because my answer choices, they're all homophones. Now, if you don't know what a homophone is, that is a word that sounds the same, but there are different forms of the word that have different meanings. So in this case, there is a homophone, right? We have the versions of there that is shown where this arrow is pointing, as well as in A and in B. Okay, next thing that jumps out to me is I have the word are. Okay, and since I have are in front of it, I know that it's going to be, it can't be it's or it is, right? We wouldn't say it is are 15 types of beetles, and we wouldn't say it's are 15 types of beetles. So I can go ahead and get rid of E and F. Next thing I'm looking at then would be no change versus they are, there, and there, right? So if I go ahead and I'll put it in blue so you can see it better. They are and there with the apostrophe. So I'll put these two in blue so you can see them. They are the same, okay? Because they apostrophe RE is the same as they are. So obviously I know B and D couldn't both be right, and they probably wouldn't put that on the SAT. I just kind of made this question up. But we also know that that wouldn't be right because we wouldn't say they are and then follow it up with are again. Now, next, if we look at there are with option A, so I'll put option A in red. So it's there are, T-H-E-I-R. That's the wrong there because that there would be indicating that it is a plural possessive, right? And we know that there is no possession here. So we know that A would be incorrect as well. Thus, we are left with option C, no change is our correct answer. And we know that that's going to be correct because that is the correct form of there, the correct homophone. So if you see a question that has a homophone underlined, understand it's probably dealing with homophones. All right, next up, some common homophones that you should know, right? I've got them listed right here. If you want to pause the video, memorize them, write them down, whatever you want to do. I'll just read through them real quick. We got sight versus sight versus sight. We have fair and fair, it's and it's, then and than, effect and affect, there, and there, accept and except. We also have effect and affect. I added that one down here, right? I'll put a blue star by it so you can see it. Descent and dissent, dying and dying, hear and hear, heal, and heard. Now, if any of these you aren't sure what the difference between the two are, you're going to want to go ahead and Google them. I'm not going to take the time to go through each and every one because that's going to take up a lot of time. And if you already know half of them, I'd just be wasting half of my time and your time by going through them if you know most of them. So any of these on this list that you don't know, you should be Googling. So pause the video, Google it. Find out the difference between the two, because these are some of the most common ones that I could see potentially showing up on the SAT. All right, next up, we got parallelism. So parallelism, I call it AKA your best friend, easy money, and quick points, because parallelism questions, in my opinion, are very easy to identify. And once you learn how to identify the parallelism question type, solving for the correct answer is fairly easy. So let's go ahead and take a run through parallelism. So what is parallelism? Well, parallelism is when verb tenses, order of nouns, adjectives, and verbs have to remain the same and parallel within a sentence. Noun phrases also have to be parallel. So let's go ahead and take a look. So we got 4 examples here. So we have Haley likes to run, jump, and swim. So what part of this is parallelism? Well, if we look at our verbs, they are all in the same tense, right? Same tense and same number. We have Haley likes to run, jump, and swim. So the parallelism there is run, comma, jump, comma, and swim. That's our parallelism there. Next, we have Haley enjoys running, jumping, and biking. Our parallelism there is going to be running, jumping, and swimming. Next, we have Jason likes riding his bike, reading his book, and driving his car. Okay, in this case, what is the parallelism here? Well, we have riding, that's a verb, obviously. We have reading, another verb, and we have driving, also a verb. His is going to be a possessive pronoun, so I'll put PP for possessive pronoun, right? And that's obviously maintaining that parallelism. And then we have an object in bike, an object in book, and an object in car. Okay, so we obviously have parallelism there as well. Next, we have Jason never ran a marathon because he is slow, and he never rode a bike because he is uncoordinated. Now, if you're going to go through and mark everything, all of the parts of a sentence, you would see that you do have parallelism, obviously. You can also just kind of tell by the way it's organized. So what I want to point out here is just that with parallelism, anytime that you see a series or a list or anything like that, a series of items, a list, 2 sentences that look really similar, same sort of length and the same sort of sentence structure, you're going to want to look and pay attention for parallelism, right? Any answer choices that contain lists, that include verbs especially. If you have a list that includes verbs especially, then it's probably going to be a parallelism question. Okay, so just understand that and then look to match and create that parallelism. So if parallelism isn't there, but you have a list, then that means you have to put it in. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're always paying attention to parallelism because those should be easy points. You don't want to miss those. Next up, we've got correlative conjunctions. So these are used to connect words that are equally important to a sentence's meanings. Okay, and I have a list of the correlative conjunctions that are common that I could see possibly showing up on the SAT below here, but let's go ahead and talk about correlative conjunctions first. So like I said, they're used to connect words that are equally important to a sentence's meaning. Some examples would be the car I bought was both fast and small. So the correlative conjunction in this part I'll put in blue. That's going to be both and the word and. Okay. Now let's look at our next example. We have you can either play basketball or play baseball. The correlative conjunctions there would be either and or. Now I've got my list of correlative conjunctions right here. It's highlighted, right? Obviously all of them are highlighted other than no sooner than. I don't know why that one's not highlighted, but I'll just go ahead and highlight it now. So those are your list of correlative conjunctions that would be common and that I could see possibly showing up on the SAT. So you're going to want to make sure that you're comfortable with those. Get a read through. I'll go ahead and read them to you as well. So we have both and, either or, just as so, neither nor, not only but also, at once and, no sooner than, if, then, rather, and than. Okay, if you want some more of those, if you're shooting for right around a 1500 to 1600, then it might be a good idea to go ahead and Google a couple more, but these are really the most common ones that you should know, right? So if you know these, then you're in a really good spot. All right, next up, we've got being concise and having no unnecessary repetition and avoiding redundancy. All right, so being concise, not having unnecessary repetition, and avoiding redundancy. So one of the big things, if you've ever watched one of my SAT writing videos where I go through an SAT writing practice test and I just treat it basically like I were taking the SAT and I give you answer explanations. If you ever watch one of those, one of the big things I say as I'm giving these answer explanations is I say at pretty much all costs, avoid repetition and avoid redundancy. We want to be as concise as possible. Never repeat something twice if you have the option to get rid of it. Never say something that's redundant. If you're doing that, you're going to get the question wrong. All right, so don't repeat information that's already been said. Use modifiers to avoid repeating the same word twice. If you ever see that you have the end of a sentence, let's say that our end of a sentence ends in the dogs. Okay, so we have dogs period, right? We have some sentence and then it ends in the dogs, and then the start of the next sentence is also the dogs. Okay, you're going to want to get rid of one of the dogs, probably this one, and then find a way to use a modifier in order to stop using that same word twice. You always want to do that. Another thing that I want to point out here is if you ever see something like annually, right, because this is just something that I've seen on the practice test, annually and every year in the same sentence, it's talking about the same thing, you got to get rid of one of those. You got to get rid of one of those because they mean the same thing. Anytime you have words like that mean the same thing, you can only use one because otherwise you're being redundant and repetitive, and you don't want to do that. That's an error. So make sure you'd have to get rid of one, right? It doesn't really matter which one because they would only pick one anyways. So they would pretty much tell you, since it's multiple choice, which one you got to get rid of. But always make sure you're getting rid of one of those if something's redundant. Okay, so don't be redundant, don't be repetitive. That's one of the biggest tips of advice I can have for the SAT writing section. If you can make sure that you're always avoiding unnecessary repetition and avoiding redundancy, that's going to do wonders for your SAT writing score. Okay, the next thing, using good diction. If you don't know what diction is, it just means word choice, and having precise word choice, right? So just making sure that you're picking words that maintain an academic tone, that maintain the tone of the passage, maintain the style, and that fit the definition that you need within that sentence. If you're doing that, you're going to be in a good spot as well. All right, next up, idioms. So idioms, there's some stuff with grammar here. Obviously, this is only a 14-day prep course, so I'm not going to get into too much with how to identify things that are prepositions, infinitives, and gerunds. Really, all that you need to know for idiom questions is that if you have a preposition, infinitive, or gerund is underlined, it's probably an idiom question. If you don't know what a preposition, infinitive, or gerund is, that's perfectly fine. I'll still teach you how to approach these questions because they're not too difficult. So basically, how I approach idiom questions and how I recommend you approach idiom questions is basically just think of it as a standard English expression question, right? And that definitely rhymed. I didn't mean for it to do, but if it's a standard English expression question, what you're going to want to do is just think, what would you naturally say? So this is especially beneficial if you are if you grew up in America speaking English your whole life. It's going to be a lot easier for you. Now, if you're a non-native speaker, then one thing I do recommend doing is looking up common SAT idioms on Google and studying them. because if you look up the common SAT idioms on Google and study them, and it's going to help you kind of learn them. If you're a native speaker, you're probably good and don't need to do that. You can just kind of think, what would I naturally say, and it'll probably be the correct answer. But if you are a non-native speaker and your English isn't too great and you're maybe not completely fluent, then it would be a good idea to look up common SAT idioms on Google and study them. But if you're a native speaker, then pretty much all you got to do is just think, what would I naturally say? So you'd see a question and it would have something. For example, on some practice tests, there are some idioms are wait for, serve as a means of, in order to be. They would probably switch something around, right? So I'll put in blue a word that they might move. They might move of, they might say something instead of. They might say as a means to, right? And you would have to switch it to as a means of. Or they might say as a means for, and you might have to switch it to as a means of. So things like that, where if you're a common, or if you're a fluent English speaker who kind of grew up in America and kind of understands the language really well, or if your parents spoke English, let's say you lived in another country, but both your parents spoke English fluently, and you're really good at just knowing the common way to say things that most Americans would say, then you're probably going to be fine. Don't really need to do much work other than just thinking, what would you naturally say? Some other examples are regard as, worry about, advise against. So once again, if you want more idioms and you're really shooting for that 1600 or something like that, then you can look up all the SAT idioms you need on Prep Scholar. But like I said, if you've been speaking English all your life, your parents are fluent, you grew up in a household that spoke English all the time, you're probably good. All right, next up we got colons, right? So I want to talk about colons, em dashes, and apostrophes now. All right, so colons. They have to have an independent clause before them, right? If you're going to use a colon, you must have an independent clause before it. What's an independent clause? Just a reminder that's going to be a subject and a verb that can stand alone on its own as a sentence. So what comes after the colon is an example that explains or illustrates what came before it, right? So the functions of a colon, there are three main functions. One function of colon is to introduce a list. Another function is to connect two independent clauses, but only when the second independent clause illustrates the first. And then the third use of a colon is for emphasis. It's similar to how an em dash is used for emphasis, but in general, you'd want to prefer an em dash for emphasis if you can, but if it's not an option, you can always use a colon as well. So let's go ahead and run through a few examples. All right, so we've got John runs on days that end in Y, and then we have a colon, John runs on Mondays. John runs on Mondays is illustrating the statement or the independent clause in the first part of it, which is John runs on days that end in Y. Since Monday ends in Y, he runs on Mondays, thus it's illustrating that first independent clause. Thus it is grammatically correct to use a colon there. Next up, we've got John swims 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We've got that colon that's introducing our list. That once again is also grammatically correct. Next, we have John has one idea that has been stuck in his head for a week, colon, reinventing the television. In this case, it's used for emphasis here. Okay, we use that colon to emphasize this idea that has been stuck in his head of reinventing the television. Okay, next up we got the em dash. Let me just see how much farther I got to go here just so I kind of get an understanding of time. Okay, we've got the em dash. All right, so there's three main purposes of an em dash. Number one, indicating non-essential information. So let's take a look at our sentence example. We have John, em dash, a math teacher, em dash, will be running in the Boston Marathon on Tuesday. So in this case, if we were to take out the information in between these em dashes, we would have a sentence that works on its own. We would have John will be running the Boston Marathon on Tuesday, completely grammatically correct that way, which means that a math teacher is a non-essential part of this sentence. Any non-essential parts of a sentence need to be offset with either commas on both sides. So we could do a comma on both sides, or you could do em dashes on both sides, or you could do parentheses on each side. Now in this case, obviously we're talking about em dashes, so we're going to use em dashes. All right, what's the next use of an em dash? Well, that's going to be for emphasis, right? So let's say that we had an example sentence of there's only one Los Angeles Lakers player to trust with the last shot, em dash Kobe Bryant, right? That's emphasizing that Kobe Bryant is the most clutch player and he should be taking the last shot. All right, another example, abrupt changes in thought. So you would use an em dash if you're going to indicate an abrupt change in thought. So let's go ahead and give an example of that. I should write an essay on Thanksgiving, em dash, no, on business ethics. Okay, so that's showing an abrupt change in thought from thinking I should write an essay on Thanksgiving to business ethics. Two completely different ideas and an abrupt change in thought. Also, you can tell it's kind of an abrupt change in thought because I do have the exclamation mark at the end. All right, next up we got apostrophes. Apostrophes are pretty simple. Hopefully you're pretty comfortable with them already, but let's go and quick cover it. All right, so possessives for apostrophes. Let's say that we have a singular. For example, John. John is one person, that's singular. We want to show that he owns a car. We add an apostrophe and an S. Let's say that our subject's plural, for example, the Lakers, talking about the basketball team. We would have to say the Lakers and then add the apostrophe after the S, since Lakers already has an S at the end. So for their court, you have to add that apostrophe at the end of the S, since the S is part of the Lakers. All right, contractions, right? Apostrophes and contractions. We have its, obviously that means it is. And we have their, which obviously is going to mean they are, right? That apostrophe is just taking the place of a letter there. All right, parentheses, like I said before, they're used for non-essential information, so we can use it to take away that non-essential information. So an example would be John, the world's best heart surgeon, is going to vacation in Florida. If we took out the information in parentheses, would the sentence still make sense? Let's take a look. John is going to vacation in Florida. Yup, still makes sense, which means it's non-essential, which means we can offset it with parentheses. All right, so now we got some random other stuff that you need to know. Avoid casual language and avoid slang on the SAT writing section. This is really important. You do not want to be using slang and casual language when doing anything on the SAT writing section. Okay, you want to make sure you're matching the tone of the passage, and most of the time that tone in the passage is going to be an academic tone. Okay, so you're going to want to make sure that you know that. Another thing, you want to understand the relationship between ideas, okay? A lot of times you're going to be transitioning between paragraphs and transitioning between sentences, and you're going to have to find the correct transition word. So let's go through a few transition words. So if we're going to contrast one thing in a previous sentence with something in the next, a transition word we could use would be in contrast or however. Those would be two good options. If we're going to show a similarity, now I know what you're thinking. Why did I write not unlike for showing a similarity? Well, this is actually something that came from an SAT practice test where not unlike was the correct answer. Now you're probably thinking, why not just say like? Well, you could just say like, but I also want to illustrate a point here. So not unlike was the correct answer on one of these transitions. Now here's why. I'm going to scroll down so you can see this bullet point. The correct relationships when dealing with these transitions between sentences and these connecting ideas between sentences, the correct relationship between two ideas will always trump any awkwardness, right? So by awkwardness, I'm talking about not unlike. Obviously, we would want to say like, but like wasn't an option. So I had not unlike, and the other three options were all options that were not accurate transitions or not accurate connections between two sentences. So keep in mind, correct relationship will always trump any awkwardness by saying not unlike. So if you're talking about a similarity, you could say like, not unlike, or you could say similar to, right? For similarities, you could say similar to this, a comma, and then this happened or whatever. All right, next up we got differences. We could say unlike. Digressions, nevertheless, right? Digressions would just be if you're digressing on a topic, nevertheless, and then you go on. Contradictions, right? An example of a contradiction here would be, let's say, while Johnson argued for the bill, he did not fulfill his constitutional duty, right? So he's contradicting his actions. He's arguing for the bill, but at the same time, he's not fulfilling his constitutional duty. Emphasis. So emphasis, these are good ones to know. Emphasis shows up decently, that's fairly common on a SAT writing section for transitions. Words that would indicate emphasis would be furthermore and moreover. Those are two common ones, so know those. All right, now we got such as. All right, so such as, you're going to want to place a comma before such as and after each item in a list, but only when it is non-restrictive. So what is non-restrictive with such as? So let's take a look at the example sentence I have here. Okay, this is going to illustrate the point. So we have, there are a lot of types of fruits, such as apples, oranges, and bananas. All right, are there more types of fruits than apples, oranges, and bananas? Yes, absolutely. Therefore, we know that this is non-restrictive. It's not restricting the types of fruits to only apples, oranges, and bananas. Since it is non-restrictive, we put a comma before such as, and then we have our list of apples, oranges, and bananas. Now, what about for such as with restrictive? So what's a restrictive form of such as, for example? Well, a restrictive form would be sports such as baseball and football involve a ball. Now, do all sports involve a ball? No, they do not. Therefore, this version of such as is indeed restrictive because it's referring to baseball and football, and there aren't other sports that it's saying, right? It can't say it's all sports because some sports don't involve a ball. Therefore, it is restrictive, and we do not use a comma before such as there. All right, now another way that you can think of this with such as, just one quick note to add, is that if we said there are a lot of types of fruits, that is something that could stand alone as its sentence. Therefore, that such as apples, oranges, and bananas is technically non-essential, so we would want to have that comma before anyway. So that's another gentle reminder you could use as to when to have that comma there. All right, Now let's talk about subjects real quick. So we got dependent clauses. A dependent clause can act as the subject of a sentence, which is kind of a weird idea to think about at first, but when you take a look at this example, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about, and you'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So an example is the fact that the New York Knicks have not won a championship in 10 years is extremely disappointing to me. Our whole subject here is the fact that the New York Knicks have not won a championship in 10 years. Now, let's say that we had to do something with figuring out which form of a verb to use based on the number, right? We would use the fact, okay? The fact is our number, and we know that that's singular, therefore we'd have to have the singular verb is, right? The part that says that the New York Knicks have not won a championship in 10 years, we would ignore that when determining the number of our subject to match the number of our verb. But our subject would be that whole dependent clause. All right, next thing, we have who versus whom and who versus that. Okay, so who should be used if the pronoun is doing the action, and if you don't understand what I'm talking about there, don't worry, I'll show you a trick for it. Whom should be used if the pronoun is receiving the action. Once again, I'll show you a trick for this shortly. Okay, so here's the trick that you really need to know for who versus whom. This is how you're going to get the question correct, and the simplest way and the quickest way to teach it. All right, so if I works in place of the pronoun, then who should be used? Now, if me works in place of the pronoun, then whom should be used. So what do I mean by that? Let's take a look at some examples. So our first example, we have all the students who are able to jump 25 inches will receive an A in the class. All right, so this is obviously correct. Both of these examples are correct, and I'm going to show you why. If I was going to say, I am able to jump 25 inches, would that be correct? Yes. Okay, now what if I was to say, me am able to jump 25 inches? Would that be correct? It would not. So because I would replace what we're looking at as the who or the whom term, because I works there grammatically, we know that we have to use who. Let's take a look at our next example. We have all of the students whom teachers despise will receive an F. Well, if we're going to say teachers despise, would we say teachers despise I, or would we say teachers despise me? We would say teachers despise me, therefore we would want to use whom there. Okay, so that's how you can figure out where to use who versus where to use whom. Next, we have who is used as a pronoun for people or one person, and that is the pronoun that'll be used for anything that's not a person or people. So that's just another quick side note. That one's pretty obvious, but I wanted to put it there anyways. And then we just have another thing dealing with homophones down there, but we really covered a lot with homophones. So that takes us through the SAT writing grammar rules I have for you today. So now let's go ahead and switch over and talk some more about the SAT reading section. So for today's SAT reading section lessons, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get started by giving a brief overview of the SAT reading test. Then I'm going to get into a description of what is tested and how you can kind of navigate what is tested to your advantage. And then after that, I'm going to get into some stuff with question types as well as some advice on how to maneuver through the passage and then maneuver through the questions, as well as through the whole reading test as a whole. So let's go ahead and get started with what you need to know about the SAT reading section, right? So obviously we're going to have 52 multiple choice questions in total. We're going to have options A through D on each of those multiple choice questions. You're going to have 65 minutes to complete this, which if you take an average, that's going to average out to 1.25 minutes per question on average. Now keep in mind that I will do a video talking about pacing of the SAT reading section later on in this 14-day SAT prep series, but not today. And then we've got 13 minutes per question per question set on average is what that averages out to with the 65 minutes and the 52 questions. So you got 5 passages in total. You're going to have 1 social studies passage most of the time and 1 history passage most of the time, 2 science passages, and then 1 United States or global literature passage. So usually one of the passages on the SAT reading section consists of 2 passages that you will need to compare, contrast, and analyze. And I guess a better way to say this rather than usually one of the passages would be usually one of the question sets, right? So those sets of 10 to 11 or 12 questions, it'll have 2 passages and you have to compare, contrast, and analyze those. Now those passages will be smaller than those ones that are only 1 passage, since there are 2 of them, but in total the amount of words will be maybe a little bit longer than what a general 1 passage essay would be, but overall close to the same size. So what's tested on the SAT reading section, right? Why are they giving this to you? Well, it's going to test your command of evidence, right? You need to be able to support your claims and the author's claims with evidence from the text. So if you're able to have a good command of evidence, you're going to score high on the SAT reading section. And I'm going to try to help you figure out how you can really show your command of evidence and really do well with this. So it should be easy additional points since any answer that you're selecting on the SAT reading section should be supported by the text. And I'll talk more about supporting your answer with the text as we go through this as well. So you want to think about any time you're asked an evidence question, and usually the form of the evidence question will be either following a question in which you stated a claim or stated a it's generally a claim. If you stated a claim, then the next question would be find evidence to support what you stated in the previous question, your answer to the previous question. So you always want to think about having proof, and you should have proof anyways, because any answer choice you click on or select for the SAT should be something that has proof in the text. So let's say that you get an evidence question and you're wondering where to start, right? So you've got 4 options and it's telling you different lines, right? Which lines should you start at? Well, the first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to remember where the best evidence for that question was set. So if you already have an idea in your mind of where your evidence is, which you should, since you probably just answered a question, and if you answer that question, you should know where your evidence is for that, or at least you should know what the evidence is for that. You may not know where it is yet, but you should know what the evidence is for that. If you know where the evidence is, right, you know what the quote was and where it's found in the passage, you're going to go there immediately, right? Go there immediately. Now let's say that you don't know where the best evidence for it was. Well, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look for indicator words, right? So you already answered the previous question. You're really confident in your answer in the previous question. Now you're asked for evidence for it. Well, you're going to look for indicator words within options A through D. Now, what do I mean by that? What is an indicator word on the SAT reading section? So indicator words are going to be words in options A through D of these evidence questions that are linked to that claim that you need to prove, right? So you know the claim that you need to prove. Let's say that that claim that you need to prove is that, let's say pufferfish weigh only 5 pounds in salt water. Well, let's say that I look at my options A through D and I see something that says 5 pounds, right? I see something that says 5 pounds as the starting, and then a dot, 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 and then at the end it says salt water or something like that. Now that'd be a really obvious one. It's generally not that obvious. Usually it's only on one side of the dot, dot, dots. It's either at the end or the beginning. So let's just say it said 5 pounds, and then at the end it said ocean, right? That would be that 5 pounds. Since you're looking to support the claim that they only weigh 5 pounds, that's an indicator word. Or for example, if you were talking about, let's do horses, right? And you were talking about horses, and you wanted to talk about how their hooves need to be cleaned every week, right? And I saw something at the end that said week, right? Referring to the time, right? So we have something in the beginning, we could just have the age or something like that, but then at the end it says week. That's something that would, to me, be an indicator, right? If their horses' hooves had to be cleaned every week and I see week in one of my options, that's where I'm going to go to first. Now keep in mind, you can't just select it based on the indicator words. You have to go back and check and make sure it actually supports your claim. So that's just where you should start, because if you can start in the right spot and then you go back and you see it supports your claim, then you don't necessarily have to read through your other 3 options. So it can save you time that way. So that's why I recommend looking for indicator words in evidence questions if you don't know where the evidence is already, because it can help you save time. All right, so obviously you're going to start with the lines that had the indicator word in the beginning and the ending word, summary, and the answer choice options, right? So basically what I just explained. All right, so another thing that's going to be testing, or that you're tested on with the SAT reading section, is your ability to interpret words in context. So these are going to be your infamous most nearly means questions. So you'll have something like in lines 33, and then a word in quotation marks, most nearly means what, right? So this is testing your ability to find the meaning of a word in the context of the given passage. So what you're going to want to do is you're not going to want to just select synonyms, right? A lot of times the College Board, they'll put synonyms down for a couple of the options A through D, and they'll expect you to just look at the word and say, oh, this word means close to the same thing as this one, so I'm just going to select the synonym as my correct answer. But the problem is that it's usually not the correct answer. Now it can be the correct answer, but it doesn't have to be, right? You want to go back and you want to look at the context. So here's what I recommend with these most nearly means questions. I recommend you look at the line that it's directing you to, and the word that it's directing you to, and then before you read your answer choices, go back to that line, find that word, and come up with your own answer choice as to what it most nearly means. Then with that answer choice that you came up with, go down and see if it matches any of your answer choices A through D. If it does match one of your answer choices A through D, then go ahead and pick that answer. It's probably right. Now, let's say that you pick one and it doesn't match your answer choice A through D. That's perfectly fine. What you're going to look at then is you're going to want to look for ways to get rid of your other 3 answers, and you're also going to want to look for a word that matches, or at least is very, very close to matching the word that you selected, right? The word that you came up with in your first part, where you went to the line, found the word, and came up with your own. If you can find a word that means really close to the same thing, it's probably right. And you're going to want to also just go ahead and check it by looking at your other 3 options and getting rid of 3 bad answers, right? So that's what you're going to want to do there. So that's my recommendation for the words and context questions. Now let's talk about data analysis. You're also going to be tested on your ability to analyze data with the SAT reading section. Now, this does not mean you're going to have to be able to do a ton of math for the SAT reading section, because you're not going to have to do math for the SAT reading section, right? You just need to be able to analyze data successfully. So let's talk about what that means real quick. So that means you're going to have to be able to interpret tables, graphs, etc., right? A bar chart, things like that, a pie table, all of that. So then after you interpret the tables and graphs, you're going to have to be able to apply the data to the passage in order to support, refute, or compare the data that you were given in your figure to the information in the passage. So sometimes that'll take the form of supporting a passage, sometimes it'll take the form of refuting it, sometimes it'll take the form of providing evidence. All right, so this is going to be covered in practice problems, right? As we go through it, you'll see a couple of these. You can also review this in the math section as we go through problems with data collection and things like that. So that'll also help you with this. There's also a little bit of crossover with the SAT writing section there, because in the writing section, you're also going to have to deal with things like graphs and tables as well sometimes. All right, so let's talk about some successful strategies. So obviously there are multiple approaches to the SAT writing section, and everyone's different, so everyone can have a different approach and still be successful. But at the same time, there are certainly I certainly do have some recommendations for most people that I think would really help them improve on the SAT reading section, especially if you don't have your strategy honed in yet. I think that what I'm about to recommend would be very fitting for most people, and I think would help most people. So this is what I'm going to recommend you do. So the order you read the passages in can matter significantly, and here's what I mean by that. As I discussed in the beginning, there are 2 science passages, 1 history passage, 1 social science passage, and 1 literature passage. Now, if you really struggle with the literature passage, you don't want to read it first. You always you always want to go from your easiest passage to your hardest passage. So why do you want to do that? Well, you want to go to the passages that you're best at first, because that's where you're going to get your most points. You want to get those easy points out of the bat. You want to get the easy points first, rather than going to harder questions where you might not get it correct. So you always want to do the passages that you're better at. So if going into this you haven't taken an SAT practice test yet, that's fine. I'm going to give one of the days in this 14-day SAT prep series for you to take an SAT practice test. Now, if you already have and you know which parts of the SAT reading section you're best at, or which passages, let's say that you're really good at the science passages but you're bad at the literature passage, start with the science passages and do the literature passage last, because you always want to go from easiest to hardest. All right, now over time, if you were taking multiple practice tests and practice passages, then you would kind of know which passages you're better at. If you're just starting this, this SAT prep journey, you are going to take a practice test as part of this 14-day SAT prep course before you take your SAT. So you could do it based on that, but the only danger with that is that that's a kind of a small sample size, because it would only be 1 practice test. So what you might want to do, if you know that you're really bad at literature, but you know you're good at science or something like that, you can kind of use that on that first practice test and try doing it that way and see if your hypothesis that you're better at science and worse at literature turns out to be correct. So that would just be one recommendation I would make. All right, so obviously I talked about how we want to make sure that we're picking our passages, right? We don't want to just do problems 1 through 52. We want to pick the passages we're best at, do those passages first. All right, next up, reading the passage. What do we want to do when we're reading the passage? So how we read the passage matters. And I'm going to explain my recommendation for reading the passage. So I recommend that you do read the passage before you look at the questions. I recommend that you don't skip lines. I recommend that you don't try to predict. And I recommend that you understand that your feelings do not matter, right? You may feel strongly about a text, but you cannot let your feelings sway your answers or sway how you interpret the text. Okay, so make sure that you're not doing that. Okay, don't let your feelings get in the way of the text. Just interpret it, find what it means. Your feelings do not matter. Okay, so don't skip lines, don't try to predict. Don't reread on your first read through. Okay, so as you read through, what I recommend is just doing an initial read through. You're not skipping lines, you're not trying to predict, feelings don't matter, and you're not rereading anything. If you don't understand something, you just keep reading. Because if you go back and you reread it, and then it's never asked as a question, then you just wasted your time rereading it. Next thing I recommend, write little to no notes on your initial read through. Now here's what I mean by that. I'm perfectly fine underlining things. In fact, I actually recommend that you underline some things, but I don't recommend that you stop reading. I want you to always continue to read, right? So as you go through, just keep on reading, keep on reading. You can underline things, you can circle things and box things, but always keep reading. Okay, and another thing is you're going to want to stay interested. The more interested you are in the passage, the more you're going to remember what occurred. Okay, and the more you're going to process it and understand it. So stay interested. Even if it's the most boring topic, stay interested. Okay, so how long should it take you to do this initial read through of the passage? Okay, it should definitely, in my opinion, take less than 5 minutes. If you're taking more than 5 minutes reading the passage before answering questions, I think that that is a mistake. You got to make sure that you're keeping it under 5 minutes, because otherwise you're just not going to have enough time to answer all those questions. So preferably under 4 minutes. That should be your goal, is to read, have your initial read through the passage take under 4 minutes. That should be your goal. Now, ideally, and if you're doing an incredible job with the SAT, if you can get it to be about 3.5 minutes, and that's how long it takes you to do your initial read through, that's golden. That's perfect. If it's right around 3 minutes, that's also fine. If it's less than that, I would just question maybe you're reading possibly a little bit too fast, but if you're a really fast reader, maybe you can do it. All right, so now let's talk about approaching the questions. Okay, so approaching the questions. This is going to be a little bit different than if you were following the 90-day SAT prep course. So if you were following the 90-day SAT prep course, you have a lot more time to get acquainted with the SAT reading section, because it is a little bit of something that takes more time than the SAT writing or the SAT math sections to kind of pick up on things. So your approach will change during this 14-day SAT prep course, but it won't change quite as much as with the 90-day. Okay, so will your approach change as you recognize question types, patterns, etc.? Yes, but you're probably not going to be quite as comfortable as if you were doing the 90-day SAT prep course, and that's perfectly fine. I'm just telling you that off the bat because I want to be honest about that. Okay, now you will still eventually develop a better feel for the reading section, right? After you take this 14-day SAT prep course, I believe that you'll probably end up developing a better feel for the SAT reading section, question types, patterns, things like that. Now, at first, I would recommend going in order, right? Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean passages, right? I already talked about how with passages, I actually want you to go out of order with passages if that is what would maximize your scoring potential, right? If you're better at science passages, do those first. Now, what I mean about going in order is just with the questions within that passage, right? So obviously, each passage has a set of questions that go along with it. I recommend that if you're just beginning, just go through in order of those questions, right? And any questions that you feel very unsure of after 35 seconds, just go ahead and skip them. Okay, and then you're going to come back to them at the end when you have more time, right? And I'll talk more about pacing in a later video in this 14-day series as well. But for now, just note that. So if you read through a question a second time and you still have no idea what it's asking, I would recommend skip it, come back to it at the end after you've answered the questions. Because if you get stuck on a question and you just stay on it for 3 minutes, then you just wasted 3 minutes on a question you still might not get correct. All right, so now you're going to want to try not to skip more than 3 questions on one passage, because if you are skipping more than 3 questions on one passage, then it's going to be pretty inefficient, because you're going to have to move on, read the next passage, and you could end up spending most of your time reading the passages rather than answering the questions. And you technically get no points for reading the passage. You only get points for answering the questions correctly. So you'd be doing a lot of jostling between passages if you're skipping more than 3 questions on one passage. So that's why I recommend trying not to skip more than 3 questions on one passage. All right, so here we get into some big things, using the text. All right, so this is something I strongly believe in for the SAT reading section, is using the text. If you use the text on the SAT reading section, it's going to help you so much. It's your best friend. Anytime that lines are referenced in a question, go back to them. If you go back to the lines that are referenced in a question, it's going to help you out tremendously, because you'll be able to see exactly what they're talking about. You should find yourself going back to the text in a lot of questions, right? Anytime you see line numbers, try to go back to them. Okay, you're going to want to also eliminate wrong answer choices. So, wrong answer choices on the SAT reading section. What do they look like? How can we identify them? Pretty much what kind of things do we want to look for here? So, right, so let's talk about this. First thing, if any part of an answer choice is wrong, then all of it is wrong. If one word in a answer choice is incorrect, the whole answer choice is wrong. You have to be ruthless about getting rid of answer choices, because there are 4 of them. And if you're not ruthless, you're going to end up getting stuck between 2, and you're going to waste time trying to decide which one's wrong and which one's right. That's why if a single word of an answer choice is wrong, the answer choice is wrong, period, you can get rid of it. Okay, so any false word makes the whole answer choice wrong. You got to be ruthless about this. You just have to. All right, so let's go over some common wrong answer choice types, right? So the SAT reading section, there are some common things that show up as wrong answer choices. So the first thing is too broad, right? And these aren't arranged as far as how often they show up. These are just kind of as far as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they're just put on there. So as far as frequency, they're not arranged in that order. But okay, so one of the common wrong answer choices is something is too broad, right? So it goes beyond the big picture, right? And I'll talk about the big picture of the passage in a minute here, but it's something that is just way too broad. It doesn't really encapsulate the topic enough. It's just too broad of of a subject. So for example, let's say that we were talking about basketball, right? And then we started talking about just sports at large, right? And we weren't even talking about basketball anymore. We were just talking about sports at large. Okay, that would be something that's too broad. Now, what about something that's too narrow? Something that's too narrow. Let's say that we're talking about basketball in particular. Let's say we're talking about the NBA, right? And then we start talking about only the Boston Celtics seventh man off the bench, right? That's way too narrow. Okay, and now that's obviously something that wouldn't necessarily show up on a reading section, but an example on a reading section would be that you focus in too much on one paragraph, or on one sentence, or on two sentences. If you focus in too much on one paragraph, then you're probably being too narrow, right? Now there are occasions where you do have to look at one paragraph, but you will be directed to do that by the question. Okay, so you got to watch out for that. Now third, another common type of wrong answer choice is something that's not related or something that is off topic. So oftentimes you'll have one answer choice that's just completely unrelated, completely off topic, and you know that because you read through the passage and you can go ahead and get rid of it as a wrong answer choice. Now another type of wrong answer choice is an incorrect relationship or a reversed relationship. So this will show up on the science section in the form of a reversed relationship. If you have two variables, they will reverse the relationship and it'll be an incorrect answer because it's the wrong way, right? So that's one thing you want to watch out for. You can also see it, I saw it on the literature section at one point, in that it talked about two people being strangers when they weren't. So you want to watch out for that as well. Another type of wrong answer choice is anything that is unsupported. Okay, this is big. This is huge for the SAT reading section. Anything that is unsupported by the text is wrong. If you can't support something with evidence from the text, it must be wrong. Okay, so just understand that. You have to be able to support everything with text or with evidence from the text, because think about the College Board if they didn't do that, right? If they didn't have everything that could be supported, or every correct answer has to have correct evidence from the text, because if it didn't, then they would get sued, right? Because it would be a subjective answer, and they can't have subjective answers. They have to have objective answers. So every correct answer has to be supported by the text. If it's not supported, then it's wrong. Okay, and then 6, like I said, if something's way outside the big picture, right, then that's obviously a red flag. So let's talk about the big picture real quick. The big picture is after you read a SAT reading passage, you want to zoom out and just think, what's the theme, right? We don't want to focus too much in on one part or one paragraph. We just want to zoom out. What's the theme of it? We want to think about the overall message of the passage. What's the feeling? What's the motive? Okay, you don't want to be the guy who's looking at the clock in the corner of your screen and missing the lesson that's occurring on your screen, right? That would be focusing in too narrow on something. You want to zoom out, big picture. What's the overall message, feeling, motive, and theme? Okay, so that's what I mean by the big picture. Now, when you're doing the SAT writing section or the SAT reading section, a lot of times, if you're stuck on something, just try to think big picture, and it'll usually help you out. All right, let's get into a little bit of strategy here. So dual passage question sets. So what are those? Well, that's where you're going to have a question set. Let's say that it's questions 11 through 22, and you got two passages that you got to read for that. Here's what I recommend doing on that. So this is a bit of strategy. First thing you're going to do is you're going to read the introduction to the question set. So this is going to be the thing that gives you your title, your author, your year. Okay, you're going to read that. That's the first thing you're going to do. You're going to read your whole introduction to your question set, right? It's going to have your author of both passages, the year of both passages, and a little brief description of them. After that, you're going to read the first passage. So here's why we read the first passage and then answer the questions that ask only about passage 1. By doing that, we're not going to confuse information from passage 1 with information from passage 2, because oftentimes they're on similar topics or the same topic, and if we read passage 1 and then passage 2 and then go answer questions on passage 1, we might mix them up. So what we want to do is we want to read passage 1 first, answer the questions that ask only about passage 1. After that, we'll see a question that asks about passage 2, and then before we answer it, we go back and we read passage 2. After reading passage 2, we then answer the questions that ask only about passage 2. Okay, so once again, making sure we're not confusing information between the two by doing this strategy. So this is how we do that. Then after that, we go through and we answer the questions that ask about both passages together. All right, so that's our strategy that you want to employ for the dual passage question sets. Now let's talk about the importance of paying attention to the question's wording. So SAT reading section, the things that I want to look out for in wording of my questions are words like primary and words like main. Okay, these two things are going to indicate to me that there are going to be some answer choices that are like slightly or maybe could be correct, but the problem is it's not the primary reason, or it's not the main reason, or the main idea, or the primary idea, or the primary focus, main goal, primary goal. You got to keep that in mind. So if you read something and you're like, maybe it could be correct, and you see that the primary is in the question or main is in the question, then if you're saying, maybe it could be correct, it's probably not right. Okay, there's probably a better answer choice that's like, yes, this is the big point behind this. This is the primary point, the main point. You want to find that. All right, next thing I want to talk about is going to be question types. Okay, so I'll touch briefly on each question type. Someone with the last name of Lindsay from Prep Scholar, she went through the practice test and she found the question types and what percent of each question type shows up or tends to show up on SAT practice tests. So we have the big picture questions are the most common. So let's go ahead and just talk about the big picture questions real quick. You can find her blog here. That's kind of me sourcing my, that's my source there. So if you want to find her blog, you can find it there. All right, so let's talk about big picture. So big picture questions, what are they talking about? Well, that's going to be when you have to analyze the passage as a whole, basically. So you're going to want to zoom out, like I talked about in the big picture, look at it as a whole, make sure you're avoiding things that are too narrow. At the same time, try to avoid things being too broad. But yeah, try to avoid too narrow, try to avoid too broad, try to avoid off topic, and you should be good with the big picture. Evidence and support. So these are going to be the questions that I talked about where you have to answer a question, probably make a claim, and then go back and support it with evidence from the text. So that'll be finding those lines. And I already discussed strategy for that as well. Okay, words in context. All right, so words in context, I already discussed that as well. Those are the most nearly means questions. We see that those show up pretty common as well. Next, we have little detail questions. So I have not necessarily covered those exactly in this video yet today, so I'll just quick drop a couple of tips here for the little detail questions. These are going to be ones that are going to direct you to something like a single paragraph or a couple sentences or one sentence within a paragraph, and you're just going to have to analyze or infer the purpose of including it there is generally what the question is about, or make an inference based on that little detail and things like that. So that one's not too bad. Really the big thing there is that you're using your text. If you're using your text with those little detail questions, you should be okay. Next thing is inferences. Okay, so inference questions, here's the big thing with inference questions. You have to make sure that it has evidence to support the inference. So the inference, obviously, since it's an inference, is not explicitly stated in the text, but you have to have evidence to support that the inference is likely true, right? You got to have that evidence. That's just huge. Sometimes you'll even see inference questions paired with an evidence question where you have to find evidence to support that inference. So yeah, inference questions, just make sure that there's evidence to support it in the text. You can't just pick anything since it's an inference. It has to have support from the text. Next up, you have function questions, right? So that would be, for example, why did the author choose to include, say, paragraph 3, or why did the author choose to include this quotation from this famous doctor? So what you're going to want to do there is just think big picture about the passage for a minute, and just think big picture, what's the purpose of including this in this passage as a whole? Now, sometimes a function question will direct you to a certain point and ask you the function of including it within one paragraph. What does it add to that single paragraph? Now, in that case, you would have to think about the single paragraph. But generally, you're going to want to think, what is the function of this in relation to the big picture of the passage? Next up, data reasoning. So these are going to be the ones with graphs, tables. Really the big thing there is just making sure that you're able to interpret graphs, tables, pie charts, things like that, and then apply them back to the passage. So that one is going to be something that you're going to learn more through example, right? So when I do practice problems with data reasoning, you'll be able to kind of get a vibe for that. Okay, and then analogy is 2% and author technique is 2%. So those aren't really huge deals. Analogies, they really rarely ever show up. And then author technique also really rarely ever showing up. It might show up in terms of something being a question about style. But like I said, those really rarely ever show up. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and switch over to the SAT math section to close out today's lessons. So for today's math lesson, since I only have about 8 minutes left, what I'm going to do is I'm going to input some of my SAT math tips and tricks videos that I think are really important to know for the SAT math section, for the no calculator and the with calculator section, because they address common questions and common math concepts that show up on the SAT math section. So I'm going to go ahead and put those in here, and then that'll take you to the end of today's video. And then tomorrow we'll have day 3 out of 14 days in the SAT prep series. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with a couple of these tips and tricks videos, and that'll round out today's lessons. So here's an SAT math section tip. Whenever you see a stacked equation set like this, what I'm putting this box around, what you're going to want to do if you're asked to solve for the solution x, y to the system of equations above is take a look at your answer choices, find if x or y has all different numbers. In this case, x has all different numbers, but y has 2 -6's. So I'm going to solve for x. Now, to solve for x when I have a stacked problem like this, I'm going to want to get rid of y. In this case, I have 4y up top, so I want to get 4y down below, and then I want to subtract them. Okay, so I multiply this bottom equation, I multiply that whole equation by 2, thus giving me 2 times 2y, which is 4y. Then I'm going to subtract it. So I have 4y minus 4y, that gets rid of my y's, so I'm going to have 0y then. I'll have 3x then minus 2 times negative x. 2 times negative x gives me negative 2x. If I'm subtracting negative 2x, that's adding 2x. So I have 3x plus 2x, which will give me 5x. And then I'll have that then set equal to negative 23. So negative 23 minus 2 times negative 19. 2 times negative 19 gives me negative 38. Subtracting a negative 38 gives me plus 38. And that's going to leave me with 15. Therefore, I'm going to have 5x equals 15. At that point, I'm going to divide each side by 5 to solve for x, and I will see that x is going to equal 3. There's only one answer choice where x is 3, so I know B will be my answer. So anytime that I see a stacked equation set like this up top, and I'm asked to solve for the solution xy, that's what I'm going to look to do. I'm going to look to add or subtract my bottom equation from my top equation in order to get rid of one of my variables and solve for the other variable. And then by solving for that other variable, if I'm smart about it, oftentimes I'll be able to get my correct answer choice without even solving for the other one. So that's the tip for the SAT math section I have for you today. Make sure. All right, here's an SAT math trick for you. Anytime you see you're given an equation up top with a bunch of different variables like m, r, n, and p, what you're going to want to do is zoom out, just take a look at your answer choices and see if you're just asked to solve for what one of them equals. In this case, we see we're just asked to solve for what p is equal to. Okay, we also see that at the end of our question. So now we just have to rearrange and solve for p. Now, you may be looking at this equation thinking, man, that's a lot of numbers. It's going to be tough to solve for p. But it really isn't, because take a look at this. What if I was to say m equals 1 over 2 times p? Well, in order to solve for p then, I would just multiply each side by the reciprocal, which is 2 over 1. Now, when I do that, I see I'd just be left with 2 over 1 times m equals p. Well, if we look at what we originally had m equals 1 over 2 times p. Now, we see that all we did is we flipped what was in our denominator, which I'm going to put in a box here, and I'll put it in a green box so you can see it better. All we did was flip what was in our denominator, and now we put it in our numerator by m. Then we took what was in our numerator by p, which was a 1, and we put it in our denominator by m. Okay, so all we did is we just flipped our numerator and our denominator and put it on the other side. So that's all we're going to do here as well. We'll take our denominator right here next to p, and we'll take it and we'll put it up here in the numerator next to m. Next, we'll just take what was in our numerator next to p, and we put it in our denominator next to m. Okay, now all we got to do is put a line through there. Okay, and now we have our answer. So now all I got to do is look for which answer choice has this minus 1 in its numerator. I take a look. I see the only option with that minus 1 in its numerator is option B. Therefore, B is going to be my answer. Okay, so I'll zoom out so you can see that full question real quick. Okay, zoom out a little bit more. So now you can see that full question. So you see how easy it is once you recognize that all you got to do is flip your numerator and your denominator and put it on the other side, and that gets you your answer. So hopefully that was helpful. All right, so here's an SAT math trick for you. This is question 12 from SAT Practice Test 1. So the trick is this. If you're told a line in the XY plane passes through the origin and has a slope of 1/7, and you're asked for which point lies on the line, well, you can go ahead and say your equation is going to be y equals 1 over 7 times x, since 1/7 is your slope. And since you pass through the origin, that's point 0 and 0, which means that your y-intercept is 0. So that'd be plus 0. Now, what you got to understand then is when you're asked for these points, you don't have to plug in these points, because if you plug in all those points, it's going to take you a long time. What you can recognize is you can go ahead and recognize that x has to be greater than y, right? X has to be greater than y, because in order for y to equal x, x is going to have to equal 7 times whatever y is. So x has to be equal to 7 times y, right? So x has to be greater than y. So just looking at options A through D then, which is the only answer in which x is greater than y? Well, there's only one answer in which x is greater than y, and that's answer D. So D has to be your correct answer. All right, so here's an SAT math trick for you. So this problem here, it's not too difficult, and you can solve it in a couple different ways, but the fastest way to solve this, in my opinion, would be to say if 3r equals 18, and I'm asked what the value of 6r plus 3 is, a mistake, in my opinion, would be go through and solve for r. Okay, solving for r is going to take you a lot longer than if you were to say if 3r equals 18, I know that 3r times 2 gives me 6r, so I take 18 times 2, that's going to give me 36. 36 plus 3, that equals 39. Okay, notice how much faster that is than if I was to divide each side by 3 here, and then get 18 over 3 equals 6, then plug 6 in for r, do 6 times 6, and then add 3. Notice how many more steps that is versus if I just recognize that if 3r equals 18, then 6r has to equal double 18, since 3r times 2 is 6r. 18 times 2 is 36. 36 plus 3, that must be 39. Okay, so just recognize how many less steps it is if I just recognize 3r, and now I'm asked about 6r. Well, if 3r is 18, I double 18, that gives me 36. 36 plus 3, that's 39. Okay, that takes a lot less time than if you divide each side by 3 and solve for r and then plug r in. Okay, so that's one tip you can use to save time on the SAT math section. Here's an SAT math trick you can use to save time. In a right triangle, one angle measures x, where sine of x equals 4/5. What is the cosine of 90 minus x? Well, the answer is also going to be 4/5. Okay, so how did I answer that in less than a second? Well, anytime I'm told that the sine of angle x is 4/5, and then I'm told that the cosine of angle 90 minus x is equal to something, it has to be the same. Okay, the sine of angle x must equal the cosine of angle 90 minus x. So why is this? Well, I can show you this very quickly actually. If I was to draw a right triangle, so let's go ahead and draw a right triangle. Okay, we'll label this angle right here x. Okay, so we'll label that angle x, then this angle right here, we'll call that angle y. Okay, well that angle y, since this is a right angle right here, that angle y has to equal 90 minus the angle x. Since angle x plus angle y must equal 90, therefore angle y must equal 90 minus the angle x. So now when we do that, if we're going to go ahead and plot that 4/5, we know that the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. Okay, so our opposite then of angle x would be 4, and our hypotenuse would be 5. Now we're asked for the cosine of 90 minus x, which we know in this case is angle y. Well, the cosine, we know that the cosine is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. We see the adjacent side length to angle y is 4, and we see that the hypotenuse is 5. So once again then, that cosine of 90 minus angle x, or the cosine of y, must equal 4/5. Okay, so that shows you geometrically that the cosine of angle 90 minus angle x is equal to the sine of angle x. Okay, so that shows you that they're going to be equivalent, and therefore if you know that, then you don't have to write anything other than this 4/5, because you immediately recognize when you're told that the sine of x is 4/5 that the cosine of 90 minus x must also be 4/5. So that right there can save you a lot of time. As always, thank you for watching. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if the video is helpful. I'll have a donation link in the description. If you would like to donate, I would obviously appreciate that as well. And as always, make sure to have a great day.